Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's April 3rd, and now that the month of March has come to an end and we've wrapped up MS Awareness Month, I think it's a perfect time for us to talk about MS awareness. And I wanted to wait until MS Awareness Month was over to make the point that none of us can afford to backslide on raising MS awareness. I think we should consider it a 12-month campaign. Now, MS awareness can mean a few different things. It can mean keeping ourselves informed about research breakthroughs that can lead to better MS treatments, or best practices when it comes to managing MS symptoms, or keeping up with pending legislation that can affect your access to quality, affordable healthcare. And I hope in some small way this podcast can help you do all of that every week. MS awareness can also mean making your personal support team, your caregivers, your family members and friends aware of how they can best support you. And MS awareness can even mean letting your state and federal legislators, your congressional representatives and senators know that you, along with the rest of the almost 1 million people living with MS in the United States, are paying attention to how they vote on the legislative issues that can impact your access to the MS medications that you and your doctor decide are best for you, or the cost of that prescription medication, or your ability to find quality, affordable health care. MS awareness can mean a lot of different things, but I hope we can all agree that raising MS awareness, whether it's our own or someone else's, is a long-term, full-time, everyday gig. My guest on the podcast today is Stephanie Buxhoevden, someone who checks all the boxes when it comes to raising MS awareness. Stephanie has a really unique story. She was diagnosed with MS when she was 25 years old, working as a neurosurgical ICU nurse. Today, Stephanie is a board-certified multiple sclerosis nurse. She's a nurse practitioner, and she's the co-director of the MS Comprehensive Care Center, where she has also been a patient. In a few moments, we'll talk with Stephanie about her experiences with MS from the dual perspective of someone who's a medical specialist who treats patients with MS and also someone who lives with MS. But first, there are a few other things that you should know about. Results of the first clinical trial to demonstrate a slowing in the progression of disability in secondary progressive MS have been published. The drug siponimod was shown to slow disability progression and reduce brain atrophy among people with secondary progressive MS. Novartis, the manufacturer of siponimod, is expected to file these results and begin the process of seeking FDA approval for siponimod within the next few weeks. You know, about half of the people living with relapsing remitting MS transition to a diagnosis of secondary progressive MS within 15 to 20 years. And while relapses are very infrequent or even completely absent in secondary progressive MS, disability continues to worsen over time. So this is an important step toward finding answers and finding effective treatments for progressive MS. A couple of weeks ago, we were talking about MS and depression, and I said that depression makes everything else in life worse, including your MS symptoms. Well, I wasn't just using a convenient figure of speech there. A Canadian study has just been published, and it concludes that depression can impact the level of physical disability in MS, and this happened to be especially true in women who were living with MS. And since Women are much more likely to be diagnosed with MS compared to men. This is something that we should be paying real attention to. In the study, researchers analyzed data from 2,312 people who had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And 76% of those people were women living with relapsing remitting MS. Over a period of time that ranged from 6.2 to 14.8 years, 36% of those patients were diagnosed with a mood or anxiety disorder, and the most common disorder was depression. And the study echoed the results of other studies in demonstrating that the MS patients who were diagnosed with depression also had a higher level of physical disability as measured by the Expanded Disability Standard Scale, or EDSS, which is the scale that neurologists use to measure physical disability in people living with MS. You know, at the beginning of the podcast, I talked about the importance of MS awareness. And MS self-awareness and self-care really begins with acknowledging all the ways that we're being impacted by the disease, both physically and emotionally. We know that it's extremely likely that about half of the people living with multiple sclerosis are also going to develop depression. And this Canadian study reminds us that depression itself can actually make our level of physical disability worse, which is why it's so important to work with your medical team to find ways to manage all of your MS symptoms, the physical symptoms and the emotional symptoms, because science tells us that one absolutely impacts the other. Last October, we talked with MS activist and the former mayor of Sacramento, California, Heather Fargo, because Heather played an important role in seeing that the first prescription drug price transparency bill in the country was passed in California. And as that new law is kicking in, we're seeing the first bits of information filter through. For instance, we know that there's a 63% price increase coming for a particular prescription glaucoma medication, and a 49% price increase coming for a prescription-only inhaled asthma treatment. And while the new drug price transparency law doesn't directly control drug prices, it does require that drug manufacturers provide advance warning and justification for those price increases. The wholesale prices that triggered these public notifications will also be made available soon. And given the high cost and the history of huge increases in the cost of MS disease-modifying drug treatments, this is an important first step in creating an appropriate level of accountability from our prescription drug manufacturers. So we'll continue to pay attention to the rollout of this new law in California. In a moment, we'll meet my guest this week. Stephanie Buxhoevden is a board-certified multiple sclerosis nurse. She's a nurse practitioner, and she's the co-director of the MS Comprehensive Care Center, where she's also been a patient. Stephanie was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when she was 25 years old, and we'll talk with Stephanie about her experiences with MS from the dual perspectives of someone who is a medical specialist who treats patients with MS, and also someone who lives with MS. I've always believed that while we can't control the weather, we can learn to dance in the rain. My guest this week is Stephanie Buxhoevden, and Stephanie is someone who has raised the concept of dancing in the rain to a whole new level. When she was 25, Stephanie achieved her longtime goal of getting accepted to a graduate program for nurse and anesthesia. But during her second semester in graduate school, while she was working as a neurosurgical ICU nurse, Stephanie suddenly lost all sensation in both legs and her right arm. This landed her in the hospital as a patient, not a nurse, and soon after she was diagnosed with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. And that was pretty much the end of Stephanie's dream career in anesthesia, but it was only the beginning of Stephanie's story, because Stephanie decided to use her experience as a patient to make a difference and to have a positive impact on the MS community. Just 6 months after being diagnosed, Stephanie became a multiple sclerosis certified nurse, and she began working in the same MS center where she herself was a patient. Today, Stephanie is a nurse practitioner and co-director of an MS Comprehensive Care Center, and she's a Doctor of Philosophy candidate at Virginia Commonwealth University. In addition to her clinical and research interests, Stephanie serves as a district activist leader for the National MS Society, and she chairs the Society's Government Relations Advisory Committee. You can find her award-winning blog at www.justkeepsmilin.com, and I'm going to spell that for you. You'll understand the Just Keeps part, but then it's MYELIN.com. And if you check the show notes, I'm going to add some links to some of the articles that Stephanie's written, as well as a TEDx talk that she gave on thriving in the face of adversity. I met Stephanie last month at the National MS Society's Public Policy Conference in Washington, D.C., and it took me about a half a second to invite her onto the podcast. So I am really excited to have Stephanie Buxhoevden join us today. Welcome to the podcast, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, John. It's great to be able to talk again.
I read something you wrote about going about the process of initiating your wellness journey. And you wrote about the importance of setting overall wellness goals and not limiting your focus to MS-related medical care. Can you talk about that and maybe why it's important to keep your overall wellness in mind and how you can best do that in the midst of trying to deal with your MS symptoms?
As you touched on, before I was diagnosed, I was really active, both professionally and I was a student, but also physically. So I've always been a rower and a competitive weightlifter, and I love to play piano. So music and sports and all those other aspects of my life really are what make me me and who I am. And with my first relapse, I had numbness from the waist down. I was having trouble with muscle strength in my legs, and I had very little control with my right hand. So I wasn't able to play piano. I wasn't able to do the exercises that I liked. And that, more than anything, was what scared me, because without those things, I wasn't sure who I was. So once I got onto an MS treatment, which was obviously the first priority, and once I really got my MS more under control, the very first thing I had to learn to do was take care of myself and get back to some sort of normal, or at least find my new normal. So it became all about physical therapy and occupational therapy, and learning to kind of move in my new body and to work around my symptoms. And that was really hard. A lot of fear held me back at first because I felt a lot of pressure to be exactly who I was before MS and to be just as good at weightlifting or just as good at playing the piano. And that was really a barrier for me, and it held me back for a very long time. But once I learned that it was okay to fail and it was okay to start slow, and I kind of refocused my energy into just doing it for me and just being the best person I could be each and every day, which those of us with MS understand that something you can do one day, maybe you can't the next day. And that's a really frustrating aspect of this disease, is the daily ups and downs. And maybe I'm running a mile one day and I have trouble walking up the stairs the next day. But that's where wellness comes in, right? So it's all about staying in tune with your body, with knowing how to listen to your symptoms and adjust day to day, and to not be so hard on yourself. You know what I mean? I think that was the biggest thing that I had to learn. And once I figured that out, I got back to not only feeling like me again, but being a better version of me. Because arguably, even though I do live with MS and it has been really challenging and it's been hard to find a treatment that's worked for me and to slow my MS down, at the same time, I've learned so much about how I handle stressful situations. It's really forced me to take a hard look at who I am and what my goals are. And as a result, I think that I'm definitely more passionate and driven. You know, I found a career that I'm just so in love with and find so rewarding. And I really think it has enhanced who I am as a person. I think I'm a better wife, a better friend, a better nurse because of it. And I couldn't do any of that without really focusing on my wellness.
You mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned handling stressful situations, and I kind of want to circle back to that in a minute. But something else you said about how one day you can do something and thanks to the wonders of MS, the next day you find that you can't. So in another one of your articles, I read something that I thought was pretty clever and pretty smart to do. You talked about having a relapse survival kit. And I think that's a great idea. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing what that means and what a relapse survival kit is.
Yes. And so this is partially my personality, is just to want to control everything and be very type A about everything. And then when MS gets introduced into your life, it quickly reminds you how little control you actually have. But one of the things that I find helpful in coping with that unpredictability is to be a little bit prepared, because there are things that you can have on hand to prepare you for a bad day or for a major relapse. So for instance, whenever I cook, I try to make double portions of anything that would freeze well. And I have at least a week's worth of meals in my freezer that I could just take out, put in the oven for my family. Dinner's done, no energy expended, don't have to get to the grocery store. I keep medication that helps me get through steroid regimens. So stuff to help ease stomach, stuff that will help me cope with the symptoms. My personal kit is that steroid taste is just terrible. So I find that Oreos work really well to kind of coat the mouth and get you through. So I have like my little emergency supply kit, and you can tell your doctor that Oreos are definitely necessary for a relapse. And really, it's about also being open with your family and friends. So one of the things that I find the most difficult to do when you're having a bad day or having a relapse is to reach out to people and ask for help. And I found that was one of the things that stressed me out the most. So what I actually did was I wrote down a list of things that I might need help with. So my right leg tends to be affected. If that gets bad, I'm not able to drive. So I have asked a certain person, if I'm having a relapse or I can't drive, would you be available to driving to an MRI or driving to a doctor's appointment? And then I asked another person, if I'm having a bad day, would you be willing to run a couple errands for me? And so on and so forth. You can look at your own life and see where you might need some help. And when you communicate with those people ahead of time, it's easy to activate the emergency response system, right? All I have to do is say, alert, alert, I need help. I need to get to my MRI. And they're happy to come to the rescue. So it eliminates the stress in the moment of having to scramble and having to worry about being a burden on others, because what I found is people are happy to help and they want to help. And when you discuss it ahead of time, it really takes that stress off. And then, of course, you need to know who to reach out to, how to get in touch with your healthcare team, what pharmacy you're going to use, how you contact somebody if it's a night or a weekend, basic things like that. And then the last thing in my kit was, especially in the first few years, I was having a lot of relapses and it was really tough to deal with. So on a really good day that I was having, where I was able to get outside and hike and do all the things that I love to do, I actually stopped and I took a minute and I wrote a letter to myself about what I was feeling that day, and just gave myself a few words of encouragement for the next time that bad day or that relapse hit. And I can't tell you how many times I have pulled that letter out and read it back to myself. And it has gotten me through some really, really tough days. So I would absolutely say that that's an essential part of my kit.
I just think that is such a good idea. But I want to talk about your TEDx talk for a minute. The title of your talk was Thriving in the Face of Adversity. And in your talk, you tell the story of how, after being diagnosed, you made a very conscious decision about how you might be able to use your unique dual role as an MS patient and an MS medical specialist to help make a difference in the lives of other people who are living with MS. And, the ability to make that choice to choose to thrive in the face of adversity is sometimes labeled as resilience. And that's a subject that really fascinates me, especially as it relates to multiple sclerosis, because most of the time people demonstrate resilience after a single acute crisis or event that someone will hopefully bounce back from. But with MS, the trauma is chronic. As you've pointed out, you never know what's next or when it's coming. So what would you say is the prescription or the strategy for thriving in the face of what feels more like ongoing adversity.
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head when you said the word choice. I think it is a choice, and you have to find that within yourself. So for me, the thing that has really gotten me through this is a sense of purpose. And I think purpose is what makes us more resilient. So everybody has what their purpose is, right? So for me, it's medicine. That's what I've always been passionate about. So it just made sense for me to use my experiences as a patient and as a healthcare provider, especially since I was already working in neurology. It was a no-brainer, no pun intended. So I think for me, it was obvious that that was my purpose. For other people, it might be their family, their faith, whatever it is that keeps them going. That's what gets you through the tough time. And as a healthcare provider, I see this every single day. And there's actually medical research on it, that having purpose in life is neuroprotective. We see less Alzheimer's in patients who have a high purpose rating. There's a scale you can administer to people, and you can score whether somebody has a low sense of purpose or a high sense of purpose. We see less heart disease in highly purposeful people. So for me, you have to find what gives you purpose. But I definitely think that has a lot to do with resilience. And that's what's going to get you through those terrible, bad low points, right? Just like when you have MS, but everybody has that. Everybody has some adversity that they're going to have to go through. With us, it is a little bit unique because not only do we have to go through that when we're diagnosed, but we also have to go through that every time we have a setback or a relapse. And we're continuously faced with those moments. And so it's really important to have a strong sense of who you are and why you need to keep pushing through it.
Talking about purpose, I always try to point out to my listeners the reasons that I find it so important and so rewarding to be an MS activist. In fact, I think regular listeners to the podcast would say that I probably talk about that way too much. So this week, I won't talk about it. Instead, I'm going to ask you about it. So as a district activist leader and the chair of the Government Relations Advisory Committee for the National MS Society, why do you find it important to take action, to speak up, and to show up and advocate on behalf of your own issues and self-interest?
I'm exactly like you. I could take up multiple podcast episodes just talking about that question alone. I'll start by telling you why I got into activism. I got into activism early on. When I was initially diagnosed, I mostly had the impact of my MS in my spinal cord. So I had lesions at pretty much every single level of the spine. And my neurologist who diagnosed me with MS said that meant my prognosis was extremely poor, that I would become very disabled at some point, and that I should drop out of school, and that wasn't realistic to continue the career that I had set out for myself. And there was a lot of people following that who were telling me what I couldn't do anymore and telling me that I can't work out, I can't stay in school, I can't have career goals, I can't have a family. There was just a lot. It was really overwhelming. And that's not how I think. I'm a very purposeful, resilient person, as we've touched on. And I needed to find a different environment and surround myself with people who were going to support me and help me in the way that I needed it. So I saw that public policy conference was happening the following month, and I decided to just kind of show up. So I went to the hotel, and I was just planning on listening in to the presenters and the speakers. And then when I got there, it was a room of 300 people who all thought exactly the same as me, who were all there for a reason, and they were going to use their experiences to make the world a better place. And they were having a real impact. Like, they were getting up on stage, they were telling their stories, they were really having an impact on lawmaking and the quality of life of other people with MS. And it was just the most amazing environment I think I've ever been in. And that experience filled me with hope. And I was like, yes, these are my people. I found them, finally. And from that moment on, I've been like full-fledged into activism, and it has been the best thing ever. So I think what I love about it is that I get a lot out of it, but also get to give a lot in return. So it has been really rewarding. to see people getting access to better health care, helping them get access to equipment and services that they need, to really influence and build a relationship with government officials and legislators has been really cool. And I think it's nice that they want to hear our stories and they appreciate that we come to them with issues. And it's really a privilege to be able to represent the entire MS community, especially people who can't do it for themselves. And I think as a healthcare provider, that just makes me even more capable of speaking to what our communities need, and to be able to deliver better healthcare to everyone.
You know, I was reading one of your blog posts, and toward the very end, you write that nobody is alone in their fight against MS. All they have to do is reach out. And I found that idea that nobody is alone to be a really important one, because I think that when someone is dealing with an exacerbation or finding that they're dealing with a new symptom today that maybe they weren't even thinking about yesterday, it can sometimes feel like you're incredibly alone in your fight against MS. So what steps can people take in those moments when it feels like it's just you and you're up against this disease that can sometimes pull the rug out from under you?
There are so many great resources out there, but in order to take advantage of them, you really have to know that they exist in the first place. And that's one of the things I'm really passionate about teaching people. So the MS Society is a great place to start because they have information on peer groups that you can go to meetings in person, or you can talk to somebody else with MS on the phone. If you can't get out of the house, they'll connect you with somebody who you can speak with and talk to. And they know your community best, and they'll plug you into whatever resources are nearby to you. Your healthcare team is another really great place to start and ask, because they also know what's available to you in your community. And I actually just finished working on a really important project called MS Path to Care, and that was with Sanofi Genzyme. And we did 4 videos, 3 different modules, and it's all about building your healthcare team, navigating resources, connecting to others. And John, I'll give you the link for it so that people can check this resource out, because I think it's exactly what you were saying. You know, you feel so isolated, you feel so alone, you're faced with something that you're unfamiliar with, and it's hard to know where to even begin. And this resource and the MS Society, I think, are the 2 places that you can start and get a bearing on things.
Well, I'll certainly look to get that link from you, and I will include it in our show notes along with links to some of your other articles and videos that you've already posted, because I think they are incredibly worthwhile. Stephanie Buxhoevden, thank you for showing us how to dance in the rain. Thank you for making a real difference in so many other lives every day. And thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much, John. It was a real pleasure.
And that's going to wrap up this installment of the RealTalk MS podcast. I always appreciate getting your feedback, your comments about the podcast, and your suggestions about the kinds of things you'd like to see us talk about. So please go ahead and send your email to me at John, that's Jon, at realtalkms.com. And if I can ask for a favor, when you have a moment, I'd love for you to submit a rating and a review of the podcast. I've made it easy for you to do that. Just visit realtalkms.com/rating, RATING, and you'll automatically be connected with the iTunes page for you to submit that rating. That would mean a lot. My name is John Strum. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time.